Today we're going to look at World War I, or the World War to End All Wars, as they called it at the time. World War I is going to span from 1914 to 1918. It's going to be a great example of an industrialized war on a massive scale. When it's all said and done, about 9 million are dead. Four major empires that we looked at in history, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the Austro-Hungary Empire, are all going to be gone and vanish as a result of this war. And the map of Europe is going to be redrawn forever. Peace that it had existed since 1815 was shattered on the continent. And basically, when we look at the end of this war, guys, it's inevitably going to be a direct cause of the Second World War, another 20th century tragedy that we're going to be looking at. Now, Europe prior to 1914 looked pretty much the same as it had since 1815, with a couple exceptions. That's German unification and Italian unification. Now, what they tried to do at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 was basically balance the power in Europe to keep the peace. And then in 1871, you're going to have Germany unifying right in the center of Europe, and this is really going to upset that balance of power. So that unification will inevitably lead to the First World War. Now, so you see the map of Europe here prior to 1914 is broken up into two major camps that we have here. The Central Powers in the pink, and then you got the Triple Entente, which includes Britain, France, and Russia, and they're the main players in the other side, if you would. And then a few neutral countries like Spain, the Netherlands, Denmark, and always Switzerland. But what we have here, guys, is a map that doesn't fully represent all the different peoples in Europe. The Austro-Hungary Empire, for example, is a very large empire in Central Europe, as you can see from the map, and basically is a very multi-ethnic, multicultural empire. There were Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Slovenians, Serbs, all within this empire. So a lot of these people that were living under these empires wanted their own country, basically. This is known as self-determination. And basically, Poles and Serbs and Croats are going to be pushing for more autonomy within these empires. But it's only a matter of time before Europe erupts into violence. The most unstable part of Europe is the Balkan Peninsula, if you see on the map where Serbia and Montenegro are. And it's pretty much oftentimes referred to as the powder keg of Europe, and this is where we're going to have our issues start first, when we look at how Europe gets involved in this massive world war. Now, one of the major reasons for this intertangling, or this war in the first place, is this intertangling alliance system that we have going on in Europe. So basically, an attack on one of these countries is an attack on all, in a sense, and each country is going to look to its ally for support if hostilities do break out. But the two major camps we're going to be looking at here, as you can see from the image, are the Triple Entente, which eventually becomes the Allied powers, and the Central Powers. The Triple Entente being Britain, France, Russia, and later on Italy after 1915, and then the Central Powers being Germany, the Austro-Hungary Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. So it's this intertangling alliance system that's really going to be the downfall of the European peace when we really look at it kind of closely here. Now, it starts to heat up a little bit here once the Austro-Hungary Empire annexes some areas that were Bosnia and Herzegovina, modern-day Bosnia and Herzegovina, the capital being Sarajevo. So the Austro-Hungary Empire annexes large portions of Bosnia. However, there's a large population of Serbs living in Bosnia as well, and there's a number of people in Serbia who want different parts of Bosnia to become part of a greater Serbia. So what we're going to have is obviously Serbs being kind of angry at the Austro-Hungarians for expanding into the Balkans. So we have basically a terrorist group known as the Black Hand, a Serb nationalist group, start to take action or want to take action and start planning and plotting ways they can disrupt order and kind of kick the Austro-Hungarians out of Bosnia. So you're going to have the guy on the top there, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who is the heir apparent for the Austro-Hungarian throne. He and his wife Sophie decide to get on a train from Vienna and head down to Sarajevo in Bosnia for kind of like a PR campaign. They're going to go and do a political move, meet the people in Sarajevo, kind of get support from them. So they decide to make it to the city, and the Black Hand, this terrorist organization, is waiting for them. There's different members of the Black Hand waiting for the Archduke and his wife. They know exactly what streets they're going to be taking and where they're going to be going and all this stuff. So they're lined up. Different potential assassins are lined up throughout the streets of Sarajevo, waiting for the Archduke and his wife to come by. Now the Archduke and his wife are being driven in an open car through the streets, and as they're driving down the street on a nice summer day, one of the potential assassins in the Black Hand takes out his weapon that he has, and that's a grenade, and he launches it or hurls it at the car. It lands inside the car of the Archduke. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, thinking pretty quickly on his feet, quickly grabs the bomb, throws it into the street before it explodes, and it just injures some unimportant people to this story. But the Archduke saves his life and his wife's life. The would-be assassin takes off running, and a lot of the members of the Black Hand have cyanide capsules with them. So this guy's running away. He bites into the cyanide capsule and then decides to jump off a bridge to make sure he's really going to finish himself off. So he jumps off a bridge into the river and lands in like 6 inches of water. On top of that, the cyanide that he had taken was expired beyond its expiration date, so it didn't work, and he was just vomiting and sick from it. So he was taken into custody. Now, the Archduke and his wife decide that they're going to go off their path and go to the hospital to visit the victims of the bomb blast that almost killed them. So they go to the hospital to, meet with the people that were injured. And the other guy in the picture here, Gavril Princip, he was an assassin who was waiting for the Archduke and his wife, decides that it's over, that he missed his chance. So Gavril Princip goes and actually has lunch at a cafe. And he's armed with a gun, a pistol. So he thinks, there's no way he's going to run into the Archduke today because this assassination had already occurred or failed, if you would. So what you're going to have is the Archduke and his wife leaving the hospital. They end up getting lost and taking a wrong turn in the streets of Sarajevo. And as they're trying to get back on the right path, they pull into an alley to turn around. As they're pulling into this alley, Gavril Princip is leaving the cafe. And right in front of him is the Archduke and his wife. So he takes out his pistol, opens fire on the both of them. This kills the Archduke and his wife, and it obviously makes the Austrians very, very angry. And that's what we're going to see this kind of breaking down into a war. Now, the Austrians demand from the Serbians specific things that they have to do. The Serbians don't agree, and so because of that, the Austrians declare war on Serbia. The Russians say to the Austrians, don't pick on the Serbs, we don't want you expanding into the Balkans, don't attack Serbia or we're going to be at war. So the Russians, going to aid the Serbians, go to war against the Austrians. The Germans say to the Russians, don't attack the Austrians or we're going to be at war with you. So then you got the Germans and the Russians at war. The French say to the Germans, don't attack the Russians or we're going to be at war. So then you got the French and the Germans at war. So now you have the Germans basically, if you look at a map, guys, fighting a two-front war, which they knew was going to happen. So what they have in mind is it's a way to avoid this two-front war. The Germans know that the Russians are going to be slow to mobilize, slow to get their troops together. So what they're going to have in a plan of attack is they're going to take out the French first, capture Paris, all right, because the French will be quicker to mobilize. And then once the French are knocked out of the war, they can concentrate all their forces on the Russians. So the Germans had this plan in motion called the von Schlieffen plan. And it was basically, as you can see in the picture here, a plan to quickly take out Paris, take the French out, all right, and then focus on the Russians. The French had another plan. Theirs was Plan 17. That was just basically to take back Alsace-Lorraine. They were still kind of upset about that from the Franco-Prussian War. So, in order for the von Schlieffen plan to work, guys, if you look at the map here, is that the German armies had to go through Belgium, all right, to do this big pincer movement on Paris. So they ask the Belgians first if they can just send their armies through. The Belgians say no, because that's a major violation of a country's sovereignty to allow an enemy army just to march through. So the Germans invade Belgium, okay, in an attempt to make this von Schlieffen Plan work. Now, Great Britain had a treaty with Belgium going back to like the 1840s that said that if Belgian territory was ever, or if Belgium neutrality was ever violated, that the British would aid the Belgians. So because of the Germans invading Belgium like this, this neutral country, the British get involved in the war on the side of France and Russia. So with the British and the French here on the Western Front, the Germans almost take Paris. All right, they're stopped at the Marne River, right outside of Paris, and halted by the British and the French. This is called the Miracle of the Marne. And basically the Germans are going to be pushed back to Belgium, basically in northeastern France, and you're going to get basically fighting continuing in the trenches for the rest of the war. Now, the von Schlieffen Plan fails, and because of that now, Germany has to send troops to the Eastern Front to fight off the Russians. So Germany now is doing what it did not want to do, and that's fight a two-front war. Now, as we saw from the previous slide that we looked at, fighting gets broken up into trench warfare. Basically, fighting on the Western Front gets bogged down in the trenches. And basically what that is, guys, is you dig a big trench or ditch in the ground, and that's what you take cover from. And so you just dig these big trench systems, and your enemy would be over about 100, 150 yards away would be your enemy trench. So you have the two sides just facing off in the trenches like this. So it gets pretty nasty, and there's casualties every day. So another thing with trench warfare that we got to look at is that you don't gain a lot of ground. If you go and capture your enemy trench, they just retreat to a auxiliary trench, and the fighting continues. So there are not massive gains on the Western Front in this war because of that. So it's going to get really bogged down into this quagmire. So by 1916, the slaughter in the trenches really heats up. You're going to have two of the major battles in the war taking place. The first one's at the battle at Verdun in France. And so basically the plan with Verdun was that the Germans thought that they were going to take the city, or try to take the city, and that the French would do everything in their power to make sure that Verdun does not fall. Because if Verdun falls, it was believed that that was the road to Paris, so it was just open the floodgates. So the German commanders thought to themselves that the French would do anything to protect Verdun. And they were right. So they said that they were basically planning on bleeding the French army white, that they just wanted casualties, that they just wanted to make it so terrible for the French that they're going to pull out of the war or negotiate. So it's at this time at Verdun that you have World War I taking on a different kind of force, if you would. It becomes a war of attrition. All right, whoever is going to last longer in this war is going to be the winner. It's not necessarily going to be about marching on capitals and people surrendering. It's a war of attrition now. Now it gets so bad for the French at Verdun that they asked their allies, the British, to open up another offensive at the Somme. And so the British agreed to take the pressure off the French. They agreed to attack the Germans at the Somme. And so on July 1st, 1916, the Battle of the Somme kicks off. And it's a slaughter for the British. It's the worst day in British military history. About 60,000 casualties in one day. If you compare that to the Vietnam War, which the United States was involved in for 10 years, which was 58,000 dead, it's kind of incredible to think about that was one day of fighting in this war. So it just takes on a whole nother dimension. Now, fighting in the trenches was also pretty nasty. The way that a lot of the commanders were ordering their troops to fight was to go over the top. So you basically crawl out of your ditch and you go running towards your enemy, like you see in the picture there, your top right. And you'd have to put up with enemy fire, barbed wire, snipers, you name it. So you'd have to worry about that being a way that you go. But guys that were bogged down in the trenches and just sitting there oftentimes had to worry about the fact that they were being constantly shelled from their enemy. So you were under constant bombardment in the trenches, and a lot of the soldiers in the trenches are going to come down with shell shock. Basically, too much stress from being bombed constantly, that their nerves give in and they just can't do anything. They can't function. They can't move. And a lot of these guys were labeled cowards because of that. So it's pretty nasty. You got to deal with death everywhere. The rats all over the place. A lot of soldiers were getting trench foot, and basically what that is you run your boots and your socks all day, and you're basically standing in a big ditch, and obviously ditches fill with water, so you'd be standing in the water at the bottom of the trench for hours on end. And what this would do is just cause your foot to basically rot while it was still in the shoe. Your skin and socks would kind of mold together in this gelatinous mess in your boot, and you would come down with gangrene. It would become infected later on, so you'd probably have to get it amputated. So it was pretty nasty fighting for a lot of these people in the trenches. Now, the biggest killer on the battlefield that we got to look at if we're talking about the trenches is the machine gun. Now, World War I is going to usher in a lot of modern-day weapons. It's an industrial war that we have going on here. So for the first time, we get a number of modern weapons that we have to look at that are being used on the battlefield for the first time. Now, as I already said, the machine gun was the biggest killer on the battlefield. So because basically, guys, both armies used it. If you were going over the top to attack enemy lines or your enemy trench, your enemy would just open up with machine gun fire. And strafe as many people as he could. The machine gun pictured down there, the bottom left. Machine guns back then often required like 2 or 3 soldiers to operate. One to shoot, one to aim, another one to feed in the ammunition. So it's kind of a devastating weapon. And basically the machine gun made the tactics that the generals were using obsolete. A full frontal attack, assault is kind of pointless when you have machine guns to go after. So it's going to force, obviously, commanders to come up with new options when fighting this war. The airplane, another modern technology that's being used for the first time. Early on in the war, airplanes were used for reconnaissance, so you just fly over your enemy trench to see what they were up to and where they were moving their troops. But as the war progresses, it's going to be used more for offensive purposes. So early on in the war, you'd fly over your enemy trench, see what they were doing. The pilots early on in the war would oftentimes take up a couple grenades with them, and as they were flying over the enemy trench, they'd drop a couple grenades into the trench, trying to kill a couple people if they could. Some of the airplanes were also equipped with these big darts that were made, these big steel darts that they were also dropping on enemy soldiers in the trenches. So it's kind of a primitive way to attack the enemy. But as we look at as the war goes on, it's going to progress. Airplane technology progresses, and basically you're going to get advancements being created in which the pilot then is able to fire a machine gun straight ahead. So wherever he steers the plane, that's where the machine gun's going to fire. So they developed technology to do that, and so basically by midway through the war, you're going to have people going up into the air with mounted machine guns to fight each other in the air. Okay, so you got an air war going on as well. If you were a pilot and you get 5 confirmed kills, that makes you an ace. The biggest ace during the war was the Red Baron, who had like 81 kills. He's a German fighter ace. So a lot of people signed up for this kind of warfare. They looked at the air war as kind of this form of chivalry that is the only place that chivalry exists in warfare still, because it's still one-on-one. It's your skill versus the other guy's skill. It's not like what was going on in the trenches where you're just being slaughtered in hundreds of thousands. So a lot of people signed up for it. Now the life expectancy of a pilot that signed up was about 2 weeks, so it wasn't very safe, but a lot of people did it. No parachutes were allowed on the airplanes. Commanders felt that if a pilot had a parachute, he would ditch the plane too easy. He wouldn't try to land it. So pilots did not go up with parachutes. Oftentimes they went up with revolvers just in case their planes were hit, and they had an option: either burn up in a fiery mess, hit the ground, jump out, or shoot themselves. So a lot of them took up revolvers for that purpose. But it's going to be a whole other dimension in this war that we're looking at. Probably the most nasty weapon used that was new was poison gas. If you look at the picture there, it kind of forced the soldiers to, have to hide in gas masks. Now, the Germans used poison gas first at the Battle of Ypres in Belgium against Canadian troops. And the gas used first was chlorine gas. And basically, Canadian troops came under attack from this German gas. And the first attacks, they didn't really have gas masks, so a lot of the soldiers had to urinate onto handkerchiefs and put that over their face to try to, use the ammonia in that to block out the gas. But it's going to be a pretty nasty weapon. Chlorine gas just affects the lungs, though. It's a respiratory gas. So if you just have a gas mask on, that definitely prevents, the chlorine gas from negatively affecting you. The more hideous of the gases used was mustard gas. Now, mustard gas got its name because it left kind of a spicy taste of Dijon mustard on your palate if you were to inhale it. But it was also nasty for the fact that if you had just a gas mask on, that wouldn't be enough. You had to completely cover up your skin with mustard gas, because basically the gas would attach anywhere on the body where there was moisture, and wherever you were sweating or anywhere, chemical burns would then appear on that area of the body. So you have accounts of soldiers being completely chemically burned from mustard gas when we look at it here. So both sides are going to use poison gas, though, and it's kind of the nastier side of World War I. The other technology in the picture that you see there is the tank. The tank is going to be used first by the British as a way that they can, attack enemy trenches, break up enemy trenches. And basically it was used at first to provide cover for advancing infantry. But it's going to be used, with more success as the war goes on. So the tank is another new technology that we have coming out. Here we have the Fokker triplane. This is the Red Baron's signature plane, painted red, 81 kills. Now, the Germans decide that they're going to try to starve the British out. The British depend heavily on their merchant navy to provide Britain with a lot of its food supplies. So the map there, the area around the British Isles, the Germans have declared a war zone, or had declared a war zone. And they say that any ship sailing in this war zone is subject to be attacked, regardless of what kind of flag the ship is flying. Could be a neutral country, it doesn't matter. If you're in this area, it's a war zone. So the Germans utilize their new technology, the U-boat, pictured there on the top right, and these are basically submarines. Now, the U-boats run on diesel, run on diesel gas, and to go underwater and to act as a submarine, they have to shut off the diesel engines and run on battery power. Now, like any battery, you need to recharge, so the U-boat can only stay underwater for so long before they have to come to the surface again and turn on their diesel engines and recharge the batteries that way. So the Germans are going to use these submarines to enforce their idea of this war zone and what it means. So they start using their U-boats to target shipping, and they're pretty successful at it. Hundreds of ships are torpedoed and sunk off the British Isles. Now, this unrestricted submarine warfare, as it's called, is basically going to hurt the Germans. Now, when this war starts off, it's not really clear what side the United States would join if we did join. There were a lot of Americans who had German, sympathies, who were German themselves. So, unrestricted submarine warfare is really going to negatively affect Germany's relationship with the United States. Because a number of American ships are going to be attacked in these waters, even though the United States was on paper neutral. So the biggest instance of this kind of hurting relations with the United States and obviously with the rest of the world was when the RMS Lusitania was attacked off the coast of Ireland. Lusitania, pictured there at the bottom right, was a passenger ship that was carrying Americans on board. And it was sailing to England, right off the coast of Ireland, at Queenstown, Ireland, and it was attacked by a German submarine. The German submarine fired one torpedo at the Lusitania, and to his surprise, the ship sank, which I don't even think he was really expecting, to sink such a large ship with one torpedo. But the sinking of the Lusitania And the death of 128 Americans is really going to push public opinion against the Germans, at least in this country. Now, fighting was also going on in the Eastern Front during this war between the Germans, the Austrians, and the Russians, mainly. But what we got to look at is that basically the Russians were getting destroyed on the Eastern Front. Many of the Russian soldiers weren't equipped, didn't have the weapons they needed to fight the Germans, and by 1916, you're going to have the Tsar himself of Russia decide that he's going to go and take command of the armies on the front. And this is a terrible idea because Tsar Nicholas was, kind of a bad leader of men, and he certainly wasn't a good military leader. So that's going to be a disaster for the Tsar and for the Russians, and there's going to be massive amounts of casualties with the Russians. And this is basically going to lead to two revolutions in 1917, one in the spring of 1917 in which the Tsar is forced to abdicate, and a provisional government is put in place, a moderate provisional government. And then you got another one, October Revolution of 1917, which overthrows the provisional government and puts the Bolsheviks mainly in power in most areas in Russia. Now, the Bolsheviks were communists, led by V.I. Lenin, pictured there. And Lenin and the communists felt that World War I was a capitalist war, that Russia and the proletariat had no place in this war, and they shouldn't be in it. So one of the things that gained the Bolsheviks or the communists so much support in Russia is that Lenin promised peace, land, and bread for everyone. All right, so the peace part was very popular among the people. A lot of the workers didn't feel that this was their war, that they should not die for these capitalist fat cats. So basically, once Lenin takes power, and this was with the aid of the Germans actually, once he takes power in Russia in late 1917, he's going to negotiate a peace treaty with the Germans to pull out. So you're going to have the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk between the Russians and the Germans that end the war on the Eastern Front. Now, this is not good for the British, the French, and now the Americans who joined the war in April 1917, because now the Germans are going to be fighting a one-front war. So that's going to be an issue. So the Western powers want the Russians to stay in. They don't want Lenin to take over and pull out of the war. But the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk pulls the Russians out of the war. And basically by April of 1917, looking at the Western Front again, the U.S. is going to declare war. A combination of unrestricted submarine warfare, basically the Germans continually sink American shipping in and off the coast of Great Britain, and a little incident called the Zimmerman telegram or Zimmerman note, in which the Germans said to the Mexicans, if you go to war with the United States, we'll help you win back territories that you lost in the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. So this upset a lot of Americans, obviously, and made it feel like the war was much closer to their shores or their border than they really had realized. So U.S. entry is going to start to kind of turn the balance just a little bit on the Western Front, but the Germans have now a one-front war. And so now that the Germans have this one-front war going on, they had their last offensive to try to take out the Western Allies in early 1918. Now, the United States getting involved really didn't do much until, midway through 1918. But the American numbers are going to help in halting this German offensive of 1918. So with this failing, with this last German push failing, civil unrest in Germany is going to be a pretty big problem. People are going to start to go hungry. You're going to have a lot of mutinies within army units, and people at home on the home front really getting uneasy. So you're going to have mutinies and revolution basically breaking out in Germany. Now, because of this, the Germans are going to be in a tight position. So they negotiate with the French initially to have an armistice, to come up with an armistice to stop the fighting, and then we can agree on a peace. So the Germans and the Allies agree to an armistice, which is supposed to take effect on 11 in the morning on November 11th, 1918. So word goes out the day before that at 11 a.m., all the guns fall silent on the Western Front. So you would think that people would just bog down and kind of stay put for a couple hours until the armistice started, but you're actually going to have commanders until the last hours of the war ordering their troops to go over the top to take territory that they're going to be able to walk to in a couple of hours, because some of these commanders wanted last-minute glory on the battlefield, and didn't think they had achieved that before the war ended. So the guns fall silent on November 11th, 1918, but what this means, guys, is that the war is not necessarily over. It's just an armistice. It's just a peace until we can agree on a peace. So it could start up at any time, back again. So the peace talks begin in 1919. Now, as I want to already stated, guys, the troops were still in the field. The Allied troops were still in the field waiting, because if negotiations broke down and this peace agreement did not go through, the war is going to continue again. So it wasn't written that it was over yet. But the main point here, guys, you have the big four are the British Prime Minister Lloyd George, Italian Prime Minister Orlando, French Premier Clemenceau, and U.S. President Woodrow Wilson are going to be the major Allied leaders that meet in Paris to come up with this treaty. Now, the French and the Italians kind of wanted to go after the Germans and be very harsh. The French especially. A lot of the fighting had taken place on their territory. They've been fighting since 1914. And so the French wanted a lot out of the Germans, a lot of reparations out of the Germans. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson brings his 14 points to the negotiating table. And these were pretty lenient on the Germans, these terms that Wilson wanted to bring to the peace talks. His most important of the 14 points was the League of Nations. Wilson had this idea that we should bring together countries of the world, should meet together to talk about their problems rather than go to war. So it's kind of like, it was the precursor to the United Nations, but this is going to be Wilson's baby. So that would be an idea that he had to kind of prevent war in the future. But basically, you're going to have the Allied powers meeting to discuss the peace, not the Germans. The Germans were not invited to negotiate this peace. Not like at the Congress of Vienna, where you had the French taking part in the negotiations for the peace after Napoleon was ousted. And as a result of that, guys, you have 99 years of relative peace in Europe as a result of the success that was the Congress of Vienna. The Treaty of Versailles here in 1919 is going to be seen as a diplomatic failure. The Germans aren't involved in the negotiations. They're treated pretty harshly with the terms, and it's not going to go well for the history of the world, if you would, because of that. Now, the Treaty of Versailles has some stipulations in it. One of it was war reparations. The Germans now owed, monetarily speaking, trillions of dollars to the Allies as a result of the war that they had to pay. There's also a clause in the Versailles Treaty called the war guilt clause, in which it says that the Germans are totally responsible for the war. Which, if you look at the way the war broke out and how it happened, that was not the case, really. Germany just happened to be the most powerful loser that we're looking at here. But the terms of the Treaty of Versailles are very harsh. And as a result, we're going to have another war 20 years later. So it's not a very long-lasting peace. Trillions of dollars in debt that the Germans that they have to pay to the Allies. There's this loss of German pride because the economy is so bad during the Weimar Republic, and just lack of pride in Germany and what it means to be German. The Germans are going to default on their payments to the Allies by the early 1920s, and then the French are going to occupy parts of Germany because of that. To make up the difference. So, it's just they're just asking for trouble with the Germans, and rather than help them rebuild or give them some sense of pride, this is going to lead to extremism in the Weimar Republic. There's going to be a lot of communists in the Weimar Republic, and to counter the communist threat, you're going to have a lot of right-wing fascists trying to stir up German unity and kind of keep people together. So This is inevitably going to lead to the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany and the Second World War.